Welcome back here on the Senior Network. Jay and I were talking about probate.
Right.
I want a little bit more education on that, if you will.
Okay, sure. One thing I want to mention, we talked off camera a little bit ago, and you were hinting toward the fact, well, who does probate affect and estate planning affect? It really affects everybody, Greg, because frequently people hear the term estate planning, they don't really understand it, they think it's just for the wealthy. Right. And that's not true. Probate and estate planning affects everybody. If you have small children, you better have a guardian appointed for them in a will.
Right.
Or the court is going to appoint someone for them. And it may not be somebody that you would choose, and you don't want that to happen. If you have any assets at all, certainly you want to make sure that you have a will in place. But with regard to probate, you wanted me to bring up again that the probate process is really affirming a will to say this is in fact the last will and testament of the decedent, and the court oversees the process to make sure that the heirs get what is coming to them. Right. Because if you have an unscrupulous fiduciary or personal representative that's overseeing the process and they're playing favorites with the assets of who gets what and not following the will, the court's going to find out about it.
Right.
So that's the reason that the probate process is really important. Another thing that I'll mention to you is we talked about simple and complex. Probate is one of those things, just like many legal matters, what you do not know can hurt you. I frequently see examples in estate administration where people that are trying to do too much on their own make mistakes without knowing what they were doing, and it turns out hurting them. I'm not going to give you an example, but I am going to say I frequently see people lose a lot of money because they think they're saving money in the short term when they're losing tons more on the long term. And so we help people navigate that process and hold their hand through the process, because I frequently have individuals ask me, well, Jay, are you going to help me through this if I need to go through it? Absolutely, we're going to help a surviving spouse or any child of any decedent to go through the process. That's what we're here for, is to make it simple, whatever is complex, and to look out for those icebergs, so to speak, that may be in the water that you're not aware of, that we can avoid along the way.
Gotcha. And that kind of leads into the estate and trust administration process.
Right. Yeah, and I do want to give you an example of that. And as I said, I work with CPAs regularly because they deal with estate planning from a certain perspective. And frequently the CPAs fill out the estate income tax return and a trust income tax return if there's one required on that, which is normally not something you would do during your lifetime, but only at death for most trusts, for example. But let me give you an example of something that might come up that you may not know that could hurt you if you don't plan accordingly. An estate can choose a fiscal year as opposed to a calendar year. A trust has to choose a calendar year. And the reason I can explain that is that an individual is on a calendar year basis for tax purposes. When everybody files their tax returns, like this year, I believe it was April the 16th, unless you file for an extension. But it's usually the 4th month and the 15th day after the last day of the tax year, which most of the time is the 15th.
You said that fast, okay.
Which is the 15th day of April most of the time, or close to it.
Right.
Nevertheless, a fiscal year may be helpful to reduce the number of tax filings you have to make for an estate. And if you choose a fiscal year, you can shorten the probate process, for example. By choosing a fiscal year, if the timing just happens to fall right, you can also shift tax liability to a future year by using that technique. And that's something I work with CPAs on to make sure that we're picking and choosing the right thing for the estate. And the important thing is that decision has to be made and told to the IRS very early on in the process. And once you've made that election, what fiscal year or calendar year you've chosen, there's no one going back to change it. Yeah.
Well, that kind of goes back to death and taxes. Death and taxes, right? That's
the things that never go away.
They never go away, right?
That's why our business is good.
Well, kind of shifting a little bit, because you've got me thinking about so much now, is you always worry about minor children and through this process. And give us some ideas of some things we should be doing to make sure that we're providing for those minor children if something happens.
Sure. Well, we mentioned a minute ago that certainly a guardian should be named in a will. Right. That's the best way to take care of that, is that you pick a couple or an individual that you want to care for your children if you're not here to care for them yourself. So that's very important. I want to talk about minor children and also children of majority. With regard to children of majority and minority, There may be an issue in terms of their spending habits and the care that they need and the oversight they need with regard to their finances. Certainly minor children, the law requires that someone is there, a trustee of sorts, to look over their finances to make sure that they're spending in the right way.
Right.
For someone of majority, I frequently have clients that say, well, I have 2 children that are fine with their finances and I want to give them their assets outright. There's 1 child that I want to protect from spending it all away in the first few years.
Right. Yeah.
And so they may leave it in trust for them and put some oversight on that person with regard to the spending. Also, it goes back to asset protection. If you leave your assets in trust for someone, just like a spouse, but you do it for a child, they may end up in divorce in a few years. And if that happens, the court can certainly split those assets up to where it's not ending up at the place you intended. But if you left it in trust for them, the court can look at that, but they can't split that trust up if you said, no, I'm only leaving it for my particular descendant, my child, my grandchildren, not for their spouses.
Gotcha.
And so that's really important to a lot of people.
Great. Hold that thought.
Sure.
We're going to need to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Senior Network.